Welcome, Noura. It's very nice to see you. I will do a brief introduction and then I will pass it on to you. So very, very happy to introduce to you today Noura Al-Sayeh. She is the head of architectural affairs at the Bahrain Authority for Cultural and Antiquities. She's also an architect trained at the EPFL, from where she holds a master's degree in architecture. And she's also a curator. I first got to know Noura's work through her curation of the Bahrain Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale, for the first time in 2010. That was also my first Venice Biennale, and so I was extremely impressed already from the get-go. But Noura also curated several other representations of Bahrain abroad, including the National Pavilion at the Milan Expo in 2015. And it was also in that year, in 2015, that she started her work heading the UNESCO World Heritage project in downtown Bahrain, and she will tell us a little bit more about this project. And most recently this year, last year, 2019, she was the curator of, invited curator of Amman Design Week. So her work as an architect and a curator are constant sort of parallel tracks that she conduces with the same ease and very inspired way in which she conduces her work as a head of architectural affairs at the Bahrain Authority for Cultural and Antiquities. And despite the fact that we are 5 minutes before schedule, I would like to give the word to Noura already and to invite her to start her presentation. Thanks for being with us today, Noura.
Thank you. Thanks, Vera. Thanks a lot for this nice introduction. I mean, 2010 was also the first time I attended the Biennale, so I was not only impressed, I was extremely daunted by the participation and the responsibility, but I remember very well meeting you, and it's been very nice being in touch and in communication all these years. And thank you so much for this invitation to do today, and thank you very much, Roberto, as well, for putting together this great program and shedding light on heritage from a different perspective, which I think is really interesting. Sorry, 1 minute. I'm going to share my screen with you, but it seems to, yeah. Yeah. Do you see it properly? Yeah. So the project I'm going to talk to you about, which is the Purling Path that Vera mentioned in the introduction, is a project that I started working on in 2015. But the project precedes that. It was an idea for an urban regeneration project that was spearheaded by Her Excellency Sheikh MAIA bin Mohammed Al Khalifa.
Sorry, no, we can see nothing. It's a dark screen. So I don't know why.
Really?
Yeah. I noticed somebody asked, yeah, there are also the other one there. Yeah.
Ah, wait, here it's telling me something. Sharing is paused. Ah, here. It had stopped sharing for a reason. Wait, no, I missed.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not on the background. Sorry about that.
That's perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
So as I was saying, spearheaded by Her Excellency Sheikh MAIA bin Mohammed Al Khalifa, who was at the time the Minister of Culture and currently the President of the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities. The idea behind the project was twofold, obviously. On the one hand, it was to relink the intangible heritage of Bahrain related to the economy of pearling, which defined the history of Bahrain as far back as the Dilmun civilization, which is 3,000 years before Christ, so 5,000 years ago, until the late 1930s, early 1940s. So this is a typical image of pearl divers out at sea during the pearling season, chuckling open the oysters in which they would find the pearls. And like I said, the history of Bahrain has been intimately linked to that of pearling for millennia. Here are two images. On the right is one of the, to be precise, not the, but one of the oldest pierced pearls to be found in the world, which is 5,000 years old. It dates from the early Dilmun civilization. And to the left, a more recent, so 3,000 years old, from the Tailus civilization in Bahrain, which was the equivalent of the Hellenistic period in Bahrain, where you see the use of pearl in ornamental jewelries. And the economy of pearling was really central to Bahrain in that the whole economy was very intimately linked to this. This is a very beautiful picture that I like to show very much, which is a picture taken in Manama, so not in Muharraq, the island we're talking about, but Manama, the trade island, which is in front of the Vonk House, which was a German trading company in pearls, where you see this incredible amount of oyster shells at the end of the season. And it looks like a huge amount of oyster shells, but actually when you know that the ratio of oysters to pearls is 1 to 10,000, this is probably, I think, 2 or 3 pearls, which you see in this in this picture. So it really shows, you know, the scale of this operation. And at the height of the pearling economy in the 1930s, pearls were extremely sought after and extremely valuable. This is a very nice story that has to do with the historic Cartier house in New York. So the Cartier brothers, which were very involved in the pearling economy at the time, had split the world into 3 continents given to each brother. They were 3 brothers. Pierre Cartier was responsible for the American headquarters, so he would often be in New York, and he was often in their flagship store where he noticed that the lady was passing by every day in the window to look at a 2-piece, 2-strand pearl necklace. So being a very astute businessman, he asked one of his salesmen who this lady was, and it appeared to be that she was a very wealthy widow who had just lost her husband and who was enamored with this necklace. So he told them, tomorrow when she comes to see the necklace, please invite her in, I would like to speak to her. So Mrs. Maisie Plant, which you see here, comes into the store. It turns out that she has a walk-up that she's just inherited from her husband on Madison Avenue. And Mr. Pierre Cartier manages to make a deal with her to exchange this beautiful 2-strand piece pearl necklace with the walk-up on Madison Avenue, which up until today are the Cartier headquarters in New York, which were traded at the time, so around the 1930s, for a 2-color strand of pearl. So it just shows you the incredible value that these pearls had. And what's really beautiful about these pearls and their history is that these very tiny pearls built the whole city of Muharraq. So what you see over here is an aerial view of Muharraq in the 1980s, taken by a French photographer. And it's always a bit heart-wrenching showing this image because a lot of the architectural heritage of Muharraq subsequently disappeared after the 1980s. Even more heartbreaking because it disappeared quite recently. I mean, when Her Excellency Sheikh Hamay started working on the revitalisation of Muharraq, so many people in Bahrain told her, you know, we wish you had started 10, 20 years ago because, you know, what we're holding on to now are really the very last remnants of the architectural heritage that was. This is a picture from 2010 of the same island of Muharraq, where you see, I mean, it's not so clear in this image, you see obviously the architectural transformations of the city, but what's a lot more radical are the urban transformations, and more specifically, the complete separation of the city towards the sea. So like in many coastal cities, there was a highway that was built to encircle the city that completely cut off a natural relation of the urban fabric with the sea. This was done through extensive land reclamation. And although land reclamation historically happened in Bahrain, so during the pearling at the height of the pearling economy in the 1930s, because the seabeds of Bahrain are very shallow, as you can see from this image, it's quite easy and economically feasible to reclaim. But this reclamation was done on a much smaller scale. So people would reclaim a small plot of land to expand their home, because Muharraq being an island and very dense and wealthy and prosperous, there was not a lot of available land to expand. But what happened from the 1970s and onwards was that there was much larger state organized land reclamation that completely reconfigured the relation of the city to the sea. And this is the premise and the context in which the Pearling Path project inscribes itself. The Pearling Path was nominated to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2012. This was done by a colleague of mine called Dr. Britta Rudolph, who had the very intelligent and smart idea of presenting this project as a serial nomination. So as a pathway of 17 historic properties that each tell part of the story of pearling. So what's interesting about it is that it's a heritage and regeneration approach that's led through the narrative of pearling. And so those 17 properties were not necessarily selected because they're the most beautiful houses in Muharraq. They were selected because they each narrated part of the story of pearling. So there's the story of the house of the diver, for example, the house of the captain of the boat, the house of the person that built the boat, and the pearl merchants, and so on. And what's very specific about Muharraq, and what the outstanding universal value, one of the outstanding universal values of the site was, is that it was a single product economy. So everything that you see in the aerial picture of Muharraq until the 1940s was built, financed, and developed in direct relation to the pearling economy. So everything in the city revolved directly around this economy. So all the build heritage that we see today, up until the 1930s, is related directly to that economy, and that's something quite unique. So the project creates a pathway linking these 17 houses that snake through all the different historic neighborhoods of Muharraq, connected through a pedestrian bridge to the south of the island, Halet Boumaher, which is unfortunately the only natural remaining coastline in Muharraq today, and was historically the point of departure from which the dhow boats would leave on their 3 to 4 month pearling seasons every year. From the nomination of the site as a heritage site to what the site is today, obviously there's been a lot of changes. The project has grown to encompass a lot more of the contemporary needs of the city, and to address issues maybe that are related more to the day-to-day life of the city rather than just the heritage preservations. And I will go through these issues through the presentations, but namely there's 17 public squares that have been added to the project, 4 multi-story parkings that address the issue of mobility in the city, a larger visitor center that acts as a community center for the project on the whole. So when we started working on this project, the main challenge was not really the architectural conservation and heritage preservation, which, although I mean presents a lot of technical challenges, are all more or less solvable. The biggest challenge was how to ensure that once the project was completed, the urban fabric in which it was registered would still be intact, or would still be intact to a degree where its urban values would still be preserved. So, as I said in the beginning, the architectural fabric of Muharraq has unfortunately been, a large part of it has been, demolished or dilapidated, and effectively has disappeared from the city. But what the city still preserves is the quality of its urban fabric, the streetscape of the buildings, the network of narrow streets. And it remains up until today on the Arabian side of the Gulf, one of the largest examples of a preserved Islamic city in the Gulf, which is something quite valuable and something that through the project we've really tried to promote and preserve. And so the largest challenge of the project, like I said, was really putting in place all the urban regulations, the urban zoning, in place to make sure that, like I said, the urban fabric would be preserved. Because when we started working on this project, the historic areas in Muharraq, in this case where we're working, but other around Bahrain, did not have a specific zoning that differentiated historic cities from other cities. So, for example, in Muharraq, there was the same, row house building zoning that you would find, for example, in a newer part of the city that was constructed. So for the first probably 5-6 years of the project, we were really only in the page, in the drawing, and in the regulations for a really long time, which was difficult to navigate with the interaction with the community, obviously, because, people hear about this project and they're imagining, all sorts of things to happen and to change. And for a long time, the project was actually just working on drawings and regulations to make sure that there was a robust enough legal framework in place to preserve the urban fabric. Alongside that, we, along with a group of students from the University of Bahrain, painstakingly surveyed what you see here, the 450 facades along the 3.5 kilometer purling path, surveying them in all their very minute details, from the exposed wiring to the exposed AC units to the protruding advertisement signs that you see here, because a large part of the project was called the Facade Upgrade, which was really to just catch up on, let's say, 40 years of lack of maintenance, regulation, permits that were not properly followed, and so on, to tidy up the urban fabric of the city. And this is a project that is now in construction, and that is really alongside the architectural conservation, probably the bulk of the work that we're doing. Alongside that, one of the first architectural commissions that was a competition actually that was launched it was initially launched as the wayfinding system for the project. So one of the challenges of the project is that because it is part of the city, it doesn't necessarily have a very clear identity of its own, or a very clear wayfinding system that visitors that come through can be easily guided through the city to visit these different properties. And the winning proposal for the small competition was won by Bureau Basmets in collaboration with Office Kirsten Geers, David Van Severen. And to be quite honest, we had initially launched this competition just as a wayfinding system, but this winning proposal, took the project a lot further and proposed to introduce in the vacant plot along the purling path 17 public squares that would really act as places of encounter between the visitors to the project and the residents of the city. So that the pathway becomes not only a line in the city, but it becomes a physical space of public space, transforming what were actually just leftover spaces. And in this part of the world, leftover spaces are nearly always taken over by cars. So these were spaces that people would park on. They were really what we call in Bahraini baraha, which is just really a leftover space in the city. In this case, these were mostly locations where historic homes had unfortunately been demolished, and these spaces had been left empty for 20, 30 years. And the project really understood that, while obviously probably the most, immediate or natural thing would have been to rebuild on the footprint of these historic homes an urban mass, in order to restitute the urban profile of the streets, it acknowledged that the city today, in order to, to remain thriving and living, has needs that were maybe different from the needs it had in the 1930s, and that there was a lack of space, of public spaces, green public spaces of encounter and interaction in the city, which these spaces very successfully introduced. And alongside that, through a series of lighting poles. So actually the street lighting of the project, which refers obviously with the circular shapes to the shapes of the pearl, very naturally lets the visitors find their way through the purling path, and at the same time doesn't outwardly try to differentiate this path from the rest of the city. Because one of the important ambitions of the project is that through this backbone of the purling path that snakes through the city, the urban regeneration efforts become like a catalyst for the regeneration of the wider urban areas of Muharraq. Alongside the urban interventions, obviously the other core is the architectural conservation of these 17 historic properties, of which you see, for example, here one of the more beautiful examples, one of the larger houses in Muharraq, which is the house of the Fakhro family, who were traders in, they owned a large fleet of dhow boats. They were traders in the wood that was used to build the dhow boats, in ropes and so on. So all the things related to the seafaring activities. This is another example, which is the house of the Siyadi family, who were very wealthy pearl merchants in Muharraq. And this is probably the most architecturally expressive building on the purling path. And from a heritage point of view, it's quite telling because it's one of very few examples in the Arabian Gulf of traditional heritage homes where there were external signs of ornamentation on the houses. Normally, the ornamentation in traditional Bahraini homes would be reserved on the inside of the house, and it shows the position that these pearl merchants had in society, that they were becoming so wealthy and so prominent that they started to show their wealth on the outside. And it's quite telling because the house of the ruler at the time, Sheikh Isa bin Ali al-Khalifa, which is 300 meters away from this house, is a much more modest house in its ornamentation and its expression. So it shows, you know, the social stature that these pearl merchants were reaching. And the interior of the majlis is equally ornamented and beautiful. And this is really interesting because it shows also the trade influences that were present at the time in Bahrain. So there's the gypsum ornaments are very specific to Bahrain, but the woodwork is very much inspired by Indian architecture, the stained glasswork by Persian architecture. And it also shows, you know, the movements and influences that were happening at the time in Bahrain in the 1930s. This majlis is actually quite interesting because it looks very old. I mean, old compared to the more recent architecture in Bahrain. But when we started investigations, we realized that this was a majlis that was built actually in the early 50s, late 40s. So somehow at a later stage of the apex of the pearling economy. And it's shown because the majlis itself has a larger span than what you would traditionally find in traditional Bahraini architecture, and it's supported by a steel beam actually that supports this extra strength. So it's quite interesting in a way, because you always look at heritage, you know, as being very authentic, but this was an architecture that somehow in a way was already built in a nostalgic way in the 1950s with modern materials that were starting to be introduced, but with very traditional expressions. And this is the proposal by Studio Anna Holtrop for the rehabilitation of the project. And this architectural ensemble in the project will house the Purling Museum, which you see to the right of this model, which is developed in a very interesting way. Traditionally, the traditional Bahraini architecture was built out of coral stone, which was extracted from the sea, and that was then covered by 3 layers of plaster. So this new pavilion that's built on the footprint of a building that used to be present there reinterprets the use of traditional plaster, but showing the inner layers of the plaster that are normally concealed by the last finished layer of plaster, which is quite smooth. And on the inside of the main exhibition room, these two rough layers of plaster are then coated with a silver foil that gives a kind of écrin to the display of pearls, and shows in some way, in a very rough way, the inside construction layers of the traditional buildings. This is another example of one of the larger houses in Muharraq, which is the Murad house, another very prominent pearl merchant family. It's today the largest remaining family home in Muharraq, and in the project it will be transformed. These are some of the images from the interior rooms where you see some of the cooling methods in the walls, which were using indirect cooling methods that were cooled on both sides of the rooms to allow for cross ventilation. So these are all natural cooling elements that we're obviously preserving in the project. And this project, one of the important things in the project, which was developed twofold, was to make sure that, you know, through the project, we don't encourage the uses of the buildings to become only exhibition spaces, you know, encouraging a kind of museum like setting for the city. So whenever possible, we try to introduce programs that would make sure that the buildings are being used. In this case, this large family home is going to be transformed by and run by the owners of the house, the Murad family, as a guest house, to allow visitors to the city to have the experience of living in one of those houses, you know, and not only visiting them as architectural artifacts. And the other very important component was, where possible, and as you know, as much as was permissible, we have not purchased any of these houses. So whenever it was possible, we made agreements with the family owners that we would renovate the houses for them, and that once they were renovated, they would be retransferred to the family to operate, run, and according to certain criteria, they would be open to the public either every day, or in some cases, they're open just a few days in the week. And these are, you know, intangible elements in the city, for example, family ownerships of homes that are really important to maintain and to safeguard and to transmit, because once these connections are lost, it's nearly impossible to reestablish them, you know. And unfortunately, across the Arab world, there's been many examples where urban rehabilitation projects have been done through large state expropriations. You know, there's a case of a project, the Souk Waqif in Qatar, or even prior to that, the Beirut Solidaire Historic City Center regeneration, where, you know, the state bought out all these large parts of the city, and once the historic connections with families that, you know, had owned houses there through generations was cut, this is something, you know, that you lose forever. This is an example of another smaller house, which was the house of a trader that was trading in small goods that would be sold to the dhow boats, so water, canned produce, and so on. It's an interesting house from an architectural perspective because it houses, unfortunately, one of only two remaining bedghir, so the wind towers, which were quite a central element to the traditional architecture in Muharraq. And unfortunately, between the 1980s, 1990s, nearly, I mean, I would say 99.5%, because these are the only two remaining. So 99.5% of the wind towers of Muharraq were purposely removed from the houses because they were considered structurally unsafe. This is the example of the interior of this house that contains, you know, many interesting decorative elements. In this case, these are scenes of peacocks, which were imported. This was imported from Indian traditions, and it was believed that in Bahraini homes, if you had a peacock in the inside of the house, this would increase your health and make sure that you were always prosperous and wealthy. And one of the last houses is a very small but beautiful house, which is the house of Badr Ghulum, which contains a very beautiful courtyard. Badr Ghulum was a medicinal doctor who would treat the pearl divers, who obviously, unfortunately, didn't live very long. They would die around 40, 38, 40, because they were diving without any oxygen, without any equipment. So they would suffer from many ailments related to their ears and throat and so on. And this medicinal healer would grow all the natural herbs that he would use in his remedies in this courtyard in his house. So moving on to, let's say, the larger and maybe more contemporary infrastructure of the project. One of the recent projects that was completed was a visitor center designed by Valerio Olgiati in the center of the city. So on what we imagine to be the point of arrival by cars and buses to the project. The site of the project is really interesting because it sits in a historic area where the amaras used to be present. The amaras are what's locally referred to as warehouses. And these amaras are really interesting because they were situated in the intersection between the sea and the souk area, the souk being the main commercial artery in the city. And the amaras had a very specific longitudinal shape, which you can see here in the image, because the goods would arrive from the sea, would be unloaded in these amaras. Part of these goods were very long pieces of wood that were imported from India because there was no wood available locally to build the houses of Muharraq. And these very long logs were channeled into the souk area through channels in these amarat and would then find their way into the commercial arteries. And while the amarat have mostly, from an architectural point of view, not so many remain, what's very interesting is that their urban typology is still quite present in the city. So you see here in this aerial, this more recent aerial view, you can see clearly here, I don't know if you see my mouse, but you see the souk area, so the commercial artery of the city that was parallel to the coastline, the coast that used to be present over here. And you see these very long typologies, which are what was previously the amaras, which you can still read in the city. And the project, you know, works on this urban typology by providing a shading structure at a very monumental scale that seeks to represent the project, which, like we said earlier, didn't have so much visibility in the city, and that was made up of, you know, small historic homes scattered, you know, within the urban fabric. It gives an urban face and an urban presence to the project and manages to link what you see here. The more modern and recent part of the city, which was built on reclaimed land, to the historic core of the city over here. And it does so through this 7,000 square meter roof that makes a link between these two parts. So walking through the project, through this very scenographic roof that obviously also has a very contemporary expression, walking through it, you walk through the ruins of an old amara, of which you see some of the remains over here, and you make the link between the new part of the city, which is over here, the ruins of the amara, like I said, and the historical core of the souk. This is, underneath this roof is the actual visitor center, which you see here, which is a small community space that houses an exhibition space, a cafe space, a workshop spaces, and an auditorium. You know, in this case, it's quite funny because what we had actually commissioned to Valerio was the small 800 square meter building that you see here. And on the first proposal, he proposed a 7,000 square meter roofscape, which we had not at all anticipated nor budgeted for, to be honest. But it was really interesting because we immediately understood the importance of the project and the importance of having something at this scale for the project, and also from an urban point of view, the importance of preserving this urban void that had been thankfully preserved as a void in the city, and the importance of preserving it as a large public space that would be able to host larger groupings of people and manifestations in the city. Alongside the projects of the Pearling Path that are related, to the UNESCO site and so on, as part of our efforts in BACA, the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Archaeology, we've worked on a lot of parallel cultural infrastructure that, although is not directly related to the Pearling Path, serves to enhance the cultural offerings of the city of Muharraq. In this case, this is a project that we had commissioned actually even before I started working on the Pearling Path in 2015, which is a dar. And a dar is a traditional space of musical performance for a very specific type of singing that's called fijeri, that's very specific to Bahrain, that was traditionally carried out on board the dhow ships to encourage the pearl divers and to give them motivation as they were hauling and diving. And it's a very interesting music because it has influences from the eastern coast of Africa and from India and Persia, which were the routes from which these boats were circulating. The project that was developed by Office is really interesting because in this case there was a typological challenge to this project. Traditionally, this kind of music was performed in what we call a majlis setting, so a kind of meeting space that was quite introverted, where the singers would sing facing each other in a rectangular setting, and this was something that was quite particular to this performance. And we didn't want to change the way this singing and performance was made, because if we had put them in a traditional, let's say, stage and auditorium setting, the whole synergy of this music making would have changed. At the same time, we understood very early on when the owners of the dar approached us that their problem, was not so much a functional problem that they needed more space, but it was also very much a problem of visibility, that they wanted to be a bit more visible in the city. They wanted, their traditions and their song making to really have a physical presence in the city. And so the project that was developed was very smart in that way, in that it introduced a stacked typology of 3 majlises, so that maintained the typology of the traditional majlis, so that when they performed, they would sit in the same way, but obviously in a very contemporary way, by introducing a 3-layer facade, the first of which is made out of this wire mesh that you see here, the second out of a series of foldable doors that completely open, and the third a series of wooden shutters that give the possibility for these performers to be completely private when they're practicing, or when they don't want to have such visibility, and by maintaining the same typology to be completely open to the street, as you see here, when they're performing. And in that situation, the street, so the urban fabric of the city, becomes the audience of the performance space, and becomes the kind of the back house of this performance space. So it transforms the city into the audience of the music hall, completely opening up a typology that used to be previously completely internalized. And in the evening, there's then a reversal of this privacy, obviously, because through the lighting, the insides of the project become completely visible. The second to last project I wanted to share to you is actually started its life not at all in Muharraq. It started its life as what was supposed to be a temporary pavilion built for the Expo Milan, for the Bahrain Pavilion in the Expo Milan of 2015. In this case, as part of our competition brief, we had commissioned a temporary building that could be dismantled and recycled at the end of the 6 months of the exhibition. And the winning competition that we chose, as you can see here, had really nothing temporary about it at all. It was built out of white prefabricated concrete panels, but it was, you know, the most compelling and the most interesting of the competition proposals. So when we decided to award it the winning position in the competition, we thought to rethink our strategy towards its permanent use, and requested from the architect, which in this case was also Studio Anna Holtrop, if he was able to build and design the project in a way that it could be completely dismantled at the end of the 6 months and rebuilt in Muharraq in a permanent position. And this is what happened, luckily, and this was really kind of, you know, by serendipity. A few months after the pavilion was built in Milan, we still didn't have a permanent location for the project in Muharraq. And at the same time, I had just started working on the Pearling Path and going through, you know, the maps and the buildings and the lands that we owned in the city. I realized that we owned the land in the heart of the city that was being used as a ground floor parking place that seemed like it had very similar proportions to the pavilion that we had just built in Milan. And I asked Anna if he could check whether this pavilion could fit in this location. And it miraculously fit nearly perfectly. We just had to remove one of the exhibition rooms in length, and it fit almost perfectly in the space that you see over here. And in a way, you know, it was a coincidence, and at the same time, it was not completely a coincidence, because the architecture of this pavilion had been, even though unconsciously, very much inspired by the traditional architecture of Bahrain, the traditional courtyard architecture of Bahrain. And you see here on this image, the pavilion sits today on the opposite side of the house of the former ruler, which is a house that's a 3-courtyard house that's organized also as a series of rooms around voids, in the same way that the pavilion reinterprets this traditional architecture, but in a more contemporary interpretation of it, with the introduction of open green spaces. And today this building that we've rebuilt in Muharraq serves as a kind of local botanical garden, which shows the traditional agrarian heritage of Bahrain that used to be a lot more visible in the country and the city previously, both in farms, but also in the plantings of the traditional courtyard houses that used to all have different fruit trees that were used by the families that inhabited the houses. And it was quite beautiful, because when we opened the building, a lot of families from Muharraq came, and especially, you know, with young children, to show them all the fruit trees that are native to Bahrain that unfortunately a younger generation today is not so much aware of. And it's part of the national identity and the cultural identity, which is an agrarian one, which is today unfortunately disappearing of, and that a younger generation is not so much aware of. And this was one of the ambitions of the pavilion, was to bring again to the forefront, as part of the national identity, this very rich agrarian heritage. So these are some of the images of the building as it stands today in Muharraq. And the last project that I wanted to share with you is a small project that I actually designed myself for the Sheikh Ibrahim Center, so not for the authority where I work in. An NGO that is also headed and directed by Sheikh MAIA in Muharraq, and which was actually the first to start regeneration and rehabilitation efforts of traditional homes in Muharraq. It's a project I designed in collaboration with Leopold Banchini. And it was a house that had an interesting challenge in both, because it had a very narrow and small plot. And the point of the project was to have a house that would show and display and exhibit the architectural heritage of Muharraq. And it's meant to house, I mean it does, the archives of John Yarwood, who was an English architect who lived and worked in Bahrain in the 1980s, and who surveyed and drew and archived a lot of the historic buildings in Muharraq, which unfortunately have disappeared. So the project was meant to display this architectural heritage. So it was an interesting challenge because, you know, how do you display architecture without making a building that is somehow trying to imitate or be a pastiche of this traditional architecture, as you often see in traditional interpretations of architecture. The side of the project, like I said, was really interesting because it was a very narrow plot between two existing buildings, one which was an original historic home from the 1930s and a more recent building on the other side of the plot. And when we first visited the plot, one of the most interesting things that was there was that the adjacent walls of the two houses had, in a sense, all the history of the evolution of architecture in Muharraq. So from the coral stone buildings that you see here to the more recent concrete blockwork that was introduced in the 1950s and 60s, to rubble stone, coral stone that was used also in the 1930s, but for poorer houses, to, on the other side, you don't see here, concrete, blasted concrete finish, which was very much found in Muharraq in the 1970s. And then in the sense, all these adjacent walls, which normally disappear when a new building is built, because the traditional way of building is rebuilding a blind wall against the existing blind wall, would have disappeared. And it seemed that these walls were the best testimony of the evolution of architecture in the city, and at the same time gave a kind of x-ray into the insides of the city in the way walls were built. So the project very easily is conceived as a bridge structure that spans the entire length of the plot, offset by the two walls to leave these two walls completely open and as the main exhibition space of the city. So you see here, so the first exhibition that you see are the corals, are the different walls of the city that have explanations and interpretations on the way that these different walls were built and at which time, at which part of the history of the city they were built and so on. On the two opposite sides, the short sides of the project, the facades are completely openable. So they, when there is a public opening or a public exhibition or so on, the project becomes an urban passage in the city that invites for more community interaction with these houses and projects that are normally quite interiorized. And you see here when both sides of the project are open, the project, instead of being a building, becomes a void, an open void within the urban fabric that creates a shortcut in the city, and by doing so exposes the insides of the urban plots of the city. So this was the last project of the presentations. There is obviously a lot more buildings and details, but these are the projects that are probably the most representative of the approaches that we have been trying to take in terms of urban rehabilitation, architectural conservation, and what it means to build today and to give the meaning of a local architectural identity, you know, that addresses and assesses what the society in Bahrain is today, which in the end I think is probably, you know, one of the most important and challenging aspects of architectural and urban conservation today. So thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Noura. It was absolutely fascinating and
thank you.
Very.
I hope I was on time. I'm trying to think. It seems okay. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and with every speaker we will invite two students from the Department of Interior Architecture to ask questions. So for Noura, I would like to invite Sara Bentivegna and Robin Delerche to ask some questions. Sara and Robin, where are you?
Hello,
I'm
Noura.
here. Can you see me?
Hi, Robin.
Oh, yes.
Hi.
Thank you for your
Hello.
lecture.
Hi.
Hello.
Okay, so maybe just a first quick question on your link to the city of Muharraq. So as a Muharraq specialist, you are particularly qualified to work on the development of this location. And we wanted to know, as an architect, if you prefer to work on a local scale with like a super strong understanding of this context, rather than thinking of architecture on a more like global and maybe less intimate scale.
I mean, I'm not sure if I can qualify myself, to be honest, as a Muharraq specialist, but I think I've gained some knowledge through working on the city. You know, there's several aspects to your question. So I obviously work, you know, with a larger team of really great people, and we've all been working and engaging with the city for over 10 years now. One of the important aspects of this is that early on in the project, probably 6 years ago, we moved our offices to one of the historical homes in Muharraq, which in terms of working on the project, and especially our interaction with the local community, was a really, really important aspect, because, you know, when you're working on a project at this scale, you're not working alone. You're working with the whole community. You know, I mean, everyone is working on this project, whether they like it or not. No, and you need to work with this component. And it made a really big difference for our interaction with the local community, for the way that they perceive the project, that we were also there and we were physically also a part of the city, because it meant that at any time people knew that if they had a problem, if, you know, whatever it is, they knew where to find us, and that they could come there, you know, and that we were there for the long run, and that we were part of the city with them. And so this, you know, when you're working on something like the facade upgrade, something like the public squares, something that has a lot to do with the wider community, your presence there as part of the community is very important. On the other hand, you know, we worked with architects that are not necessarily Muharraq specialists, you know, like, I mean, most of the architects we've worked on did not have a prior knowledge to Muharraq when they started working with the city. You know, does this make their additions to the city less valuable? I don't think so, because sometimes, you know, there is an added value also to have an external perspective to the project. You know, I mentioned this, for example, a lot of the projects that we commissioned, you know, with a very local knowledge of the city, probably didn't have enough distance to the city to be able to introduce things you know, that were adding a value that we did not see at the time. You know, I mentioned, for example, the wayfinding system. We had commissioned it as a wayfinding system. We did not think in our day-to-day interaction and being very involved, you know, in the history of the city, that actually, you know, let's look at this a bit further. It's, even though this is not indigenous to the city, it's interesting and important to introduce green public spaces to the city. You know, this came from an external understanding of a city, and it came from looking at it in an abstract way on a map. You know, Basmes, Kirsten and David looked at this, said, you know, there's all these voids in the city. Is this an opportunity to develop something different? You know, in the same way the project developed by Valerio, we had not thought of introducing something so monumental to the city. You know, we were very involved in the day-to-day of, you know, conserving these small historical spaces, and actually, you know, this roofscape, which is very large and very monumental, is something that added a lot of value to the project, because it addressed the project at an urban scale, which we were maybe not thinking of at the time. It gave it visibility. It managed to bridge, you know, the new parts of the city with the historic parts of the city. So, you know, both of these approaches have value, and I think both of them are really important when you develop such a project. And I think what's really important to keep in mind when you're working on such a large scale is that the multitude of opinions and points of views and diversity is really important. You know, it's really important not to make a project that's very homogeneous, you know, and that has a very kind of linear and coherent approach, because cities are not always coherent, you know, and it needs to make space for all of this. So what we've learned in developing this project is that you first of all always need to re-question what the project is doing, you know, every couple of months, every couple of years. You know, the project that was inscribed on the UNESCO is not exactly the project that we're implementing today. We reassess the project ourselves all the time. When we get, you know, different points of view from people that are coming from different parts of the world, that come with their own experience and their own projections on the city, we also re-question ourselves, you know, and ask, is this something actually that's going to benefit the project?
I would invite maybe Sarah to do one more question, and then we will have to move on to our next presenter. Sarah, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so I think it says Robin is my name, but that's not my name. My name is Sarah. But yeah, so one final question. So in one of your interviews, you mentioned losing a part of what makes the identity of Bahrain. Do you think your work as an architect has the power to sustain what still exists, or also to bring back to life some elements of the past?
I mean, it can definitely sustain a bit of what's remaining, that's for sure. That's one of the first, you know, one of the first purposes of the project. But I think what's more important and more challenging and probably more relevant today, and what I mentioned at the end of the talk, is how you develop in building something new, which is a large part of also our you know, our heritage protection efforts. How do you build something new in these historical quarters that represent what Bahrain is today, you know, what a traditional Bahraini or indigenous Bahraini architecture is today? And that's, you know, one of the most challenging and important questions, because it reflects who we are as a society today. And for me, you know, this is something really important, because in the Gulf, you know, now things are changing a bit, but when I started working on this in Bahrain and on this project 10, 15 years ago, you know, architecture was either very nostalgic, so either in the best case in preserving the new, or realistically in most cases in rebuilding as if it was old, or in very futuristic projections, mostly developed by real estate developers, of, you know, a kind of corporate architecture that didn't have so much identity, and that was mostly built on kind of reclaimed land. And in between these two, you know, depictions of the past and projections in the future, there was very little, the present, in a way, was not really present, you know. I mean, where we are today, both in terms of what the urban fabric looks like and what it's possible and what it means to build today with a local architecture, what was not present there a lot. And I thought it was really important for us to introduce this, you know, and to think about, you know, what we build today and what this, you know, represents as a society. And it's a very important thing, you know, for a younger generation of architects to understand that we as a society today can also build buildings of value who in 100 years will in turn be worthy enough of preserving, you know. And I think this, this is one of the main challenges of the project that we're constantly trying to respond to and to address.
Thank you very much, Noura. And thank you for this very in-depth and multi-layered presentation that manages to show all the different forces and players at stake in such a complex project.
Thank you.